We'll put it on the Facebook page and then we'll let people in. Okay, I'm going to start letting people in. Welcome to everyone here. Thank you for being here. We're going to get started in about 7 minutes at 3:35. Hello to everyone who's just joining. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to get started in about 5 minutes. Thank you for your patience. Hello to everyone just joining. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to get started at 3:35, so just in a few minutes here. Thank you for your patience. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes here. We'll get started in about a minute here. Also, I live downstairs from some musical theater majors, so I don't know if you can hear them belting right now. All right, I think we'll get started here. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's lovely to have your attention and your attendance and your energy. Really excited for this next event. A panel of professors and scholars to speak on some incredibly timely and imperative topics. First, I want to just say thank you to my co-organizers, Alon Sullivan, Josie Alla, Meg Brennan, Sammy Sussman, Eliza Salem, Bob Hurst, Ed Sereth, Aidan Taylor, and Mark Hannaford. I want to say thank you for the sponsor of this event, the Alliance for the Transformation of Musical Academe. And I want to say that we will be opening a Q&A after each presenter. And if you wish to be considered to ask a question, chat me directly, privately, and I'll put you in the queue and I'll let you know when it's time to unmute yourself. For our first speaker, we have Stephanie Jensen-Moulton, who is an associate professor of musicology. She has published articles on women in hip hop, the 19th century piano prodigy Blind Tom Wiggins, Pauline Oliveros, and other topics in American music. She has presented papers and lecture recitals at numerous national and international conferences, including national meetings of the Society for American Music and the American Musicological Society. The title of Stephanie's talk today is What's So Bad About Feeling Good? White Fragility in the Music Fields. Stephanie, take it away.
Okay. I'm just going to say I thought Ashleigh was going first, but if we want to switch it around, we can totally do that.
Oh my gosh, I put it in the... Oh my gosh, I apologize.
That's totally okay. I'm very happy to go first, but I think Ashleigh might want to.
Yes, my apologies.
I'm so sorry, Allison.
Ashleigh. Great, well. Ashleigh is co-founder, artistic and executive director of Castle of Our Skins. She's a Boston-based concert, which is a Boston-based concert and educational series devoted to celebrating Black artistry through music. She is a 2015 St. Botolph Emerging Artist Award recipient, a 2019 Brother Thomas Fellow, a nominee for the 2020 Americans for the Arts Johnson Fellowship for Artists Transforming Communities, and named one of WBUR's ARTery 25 Millennials of Color Impacting Boston's Arts and Culture Scene. Today, Ashleigh will be discussing Florence Price's 1943 letter to then Boston Symphony Orchestra conductor Serge Koussevitzky. She remarked of her two handicaps, race and sex, and her desire to be considered an artist all the same. Her story is emblematic of both a moment in time and the long-standing and present perspective, treatment, and legacy of Black women composers in classical music. Ashleigh?
Great, thank you. And thank you, Stephanie. I look forward to hearing your very encapsulating speech as a talk as well. Thank you for having me here. I'm looking forward to all of the discussion, all of the presentations, as well as the conversation. In addition to my work with Castle of Erskines, I recently joined the faculty of the Longy School of Music in Cambridge, which is very much not Boston. Anyone living here would tell you. But at this school, I'm teaching a course on composers from the African diaspora. And in sharing with my class, we were talking recently about intersectionality, and the concept seemed to quite easily be graspable, one that they could really understand and sort of sink their teeth into. It was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and I'm just going to do a quick screen share as I speak as well. Hopefully you can start to see this. Go back to the beginning here. Intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. It really speaks to the overlaps of various characteristics, really with race, with gender, with class, sexuality, nationality, etc. Just a brief quote here from Kimberly Crenshaw. With a Black woman as the starting point, it becomes more apparent how dominant conceptions of discrimination condition us to think about subordination as disadvantage occurring along a single categorical axis. I want to suggest further that this single axis framework erases Black women in the conceptualization, identification, and remediation of race and sex discrimination by limiting inquiry to the experiences of otherwise privileged members of the group. And by doing this single categorical access, thinking that you are either Black, you are either a woman, but you cannot be something that is so nuanced, is one that she was really speaking to. And the nuances really lie in the shades of color that you find in this sort of Venn diagram, where it's deeper shades of blues, deeper shades of greens and purples, the sort of overlap where these characteristics exist. This complicated, nuanced, richly layered impression of who we are as people really seemed to be quite obvious again to my class of primarily graduate students, and one that they really had no questions. It was sort of like a aha, duh sort of moment. But we looked deeper into history, and I'm going to dive a little bit outside of music to be able to sort of underline this point about how easily this seemingly understood concept has been misunderstood and misrepresented. So if I take a look at intersectionality and politics, and this is very much a truncated sort of view, really even dating back to 1776, where white men were seen as citizens. In 1790, a naturalization law where free white immigrants became citizens. And certainly if you are a citizen, then you were able to vote. In New Jersey, a few years later, about in 1807, early 1800s, African American and women who could vote since 1776, a law had changed that only tax-paying white male citizens could vote, therefore barring women and African American women. It continues in 1856, where all states, North Carolina being the last state, said that white men could vote. Going into Reconstruction period after the Civil War with the 14th and the 15th Amendments, saying that citizenship could be defined to former slaves, and that there could be no denial of voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It did not include sex, which is where you, some generations later, have to figure out about sex as it relates to the privilege of being able to vote. 1876, Supreme Court rules that Native Americans are not citizens as defined by the previous 14th Amendment. Therefore, they, as citizens, being denied citizenship, could not vote. It continues in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, barring Chinese people of people of Chinese ancestry from naturalizing to become citizens, therefore having the right to vote. This year marked the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which allowed voting for women, right? No exclusion on the basis of sex, but really gave white women the right to vote. And it would be some generations later before Asian, before people of color, before Black women were able to vote. I'll sort of paraphrase a little bit this example about intersectionality as it relates to politics and just the various nuances. And again, the sort of messy hybridity where you start to not just define something by a singular axis, as Kimberly Crenshaw defined, but by the hybridity, by the sort of hyphenations of these characteristic points. And we have an example here with politics, especially as it relates to this country, where it was very much defined by single narratives. So for centuries, there has been this intentional siloing of these what are naturally deeply entwined fabrics that make us who we are. The concept of either or thinking that dominates white supremacy culture that maybe Stephanie can help undermine for us, unpack for us a little later on, runs deep, as we see here in politics. You are, as I said before, either Black or woman, but you can't exist in this unique hybridity of a Black woman, as the 1976 DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors case determined. And this was a case that Kimberly Crenshaw noted, where 5 Black women at General Motors were saying that they were discriminated against because they were Black women. General Motors then said, we have Black men as employees, and we have white women as employees. Therefore, there is no racial or sexual discrimination. And again, could not see that there was a hybridity between there, that there was an overlap in what would be a Venn diagram of sexuality and, of gender and of race. Music is no different. This long-standing preference for a single categorization affects this field as well. And the story that I would really love to highlight as a springboard is the story of Florence Price, as well as other Black women composers in the classical field. So Florence Price, the daughter of an affluent dentist, inventor, artist, writer father, and elementary school teacher mother, was born in 1887 in Little Rock, Arkansas, to an upper middle class Black family. She was dually steeped in the music of the Black church and Western classical music, with her mother being her first piano teacher. She published her first composition at age 11, graduated valedictorian from her high school, and excelled as a phenomenal pianist, organist, and composer at Boston's New England Conservatory, which is my alma mater. She was an active member of Chicago's rich Black Renaissance, where she taught, composed, and received career-elevating awards as a single mother of 2 small children. A woman of mixed heritage, she had French, Indian, and Spanish on her mother's side, and Black, Indian, and English on her father's side. She was a complex creative and leader who drew inspiration from African, Black American, and Western European worlds. Despite all of these rich layers and complicated overlaps, she was bifurcated to the most basic and obvious physical elements: that she was Black and a woman. She acknowledged being a victim of racial and gender stereotypes in a famous 1943 letter to the then Boston Symphony Orchestra conductor, Serge Koussevitzky, which I'll read this full letter that Allison had also referenced. My dear Koussevitzky, she says, to begin with, I have 2 handicaps, those of sex and race. I am a woman, and I have some Negro blood in my veins. Knowing the worst, then, would you be good enough to hold in check the possible inclination to regard women's composition as long on emotionalism, but short on virility and thought content, until you shall have examined some of my work? As to the handicap of race, may I relieve you by saying that I neither expect nor ask any concession on that score. I should like to be judged on merit alone, the great trouble having been to get conductors who know nothing of my work to even consent to examine a score. Recognizing her handicaps, she says, wanting to make sure that those are not the sole impression that Koussevitzky or anyone else viewing her music would create value, some sort of value judgment on her work, but strive to reach beyond that, beyond those stereotypes and those perceptions, to be able to recognize her music as being craft. Needless to say, Kusavisky, or maybe to reiterate, Kusavisky did not acknowledge her request. And it would be another 76 years, March of 2019, just last year, before the BSO would perform one movement of her Third Symphony in their Symphony Hall here in Boston. Price's story is emblematic of both a moment in time, thinking historically, and the long-standing and present perspective, treatment, and legacy of Black women composers in classical music. The Dean of African American Composers, Undine Smith Moore, spoke on this as well. Born in 1904 in Virginia, Smith Moore is perhaps best known as a committed educator, being on faculty at Virginia State College, which is now Virginia State University, for 45 years. She co-directed the school's Black Music Center. She was also a pianist and a composer of vocal music. She cautioned against the white Eurocentric idea of an individual, quote, individual, great master, which stokes the sense of consolidated power hoarding found also within white supremacy culture. As scholar Helen Walker Hill noted, Undine Smith Moore's, quote, emphasized that Black music is a house of many mansions. Blacks have music, many musics, and some of them relate in an extremely universal way to the human condition, end quote. This acknowledged diversity with which she advocated certainly defied the easy categorization and marketability at the time of the singular Negro composer or the Negro female composer to sort of elevate and highlight as, again, an individual or a singularity. Of women in general, she noted that they, quote, for a long time in the past were indoctrinated with the widely held belief that the abstract is not their sphere, meaning creative, things that are not tangible, and that the ability to transmute inner sources by giving them artistic form is a discipline suitable only to men. So to be able to take these thoughts and imaginations and put them into something as beautiful and highly regarded as an artistic craft, such as composition, is only something suitable for men. This was the perception, and this was sort of what was understood at the time. Not only were there roadblocks for women who didn't see themselves represented, but also didn't see themselves supported, there were also factors related to the unique responsibility women held at the society at that time that were also prohibitive for them. Again, scholar Helen Walker Hill noted Undine Smith Moore's response to this when she herself was asked if she would ever consider devoting herself fully to becoming a composer. Smith Moore remarked, "This question was surely written for men. Their wives assume those dreary responsibilities which make it possible for them to compose. It would be fine to have a life so ordered that other everyday responsibilities did not impinge so heavily on my time." So her as a woman and various responsibilities and social responsibilities and perceptions that are attached and attributed to that being related in with respects to her craft adds such layers of complexity to her outpouring, to her own perception, to her own ability to fully realize, even if she wanted to fully realize her craft. Those social, racial, and gender factors, intrinsically interwoven beyond her control, worked both to define and restrict the reception, publication, and legacy of her work and her life. Both Florence Price and Undine Smith Moore's, their stories are not oddities or rare occurrences that run against the norm, thinking even historically and certainly through present day. They're messy overlaps of race, gender, class, self-identification versus sort of societal perception, their desire to be expressive versus the expectation of what that expressivity could and should be, affected other composers as well. So Julia Perry, for instance, a modernist who was active in the 1950s and 1960s, said, quote, would not have asserted her identity as a woman composer or a Negro composer. end quote, and fought in her early career to really work against the obvious categorizations white upper class members of society didn't have to cast upon themselves. Another composer, African-American composer, Dorothy Wood Moore, now in her 80s, brought the struggle intentionally of the civil rights era and the Black feminist movement into her compositions to very strategically align with race and with gender and with her art. Thinking even literally just yesterday in the New York Times, there was an article where contemporary composer and violinist Jessie Montgomery was noted to offer a response to this uptick right now that we're experiencing with Black Lives Matter and all the sort of permutations and sectors that can relate to. So she noted that she is concerned that I'm being programmed just to fit a mold, like I'm being tokenized, and that at the end of the day, I, meaning Jessie, just want to make music. I want to feel as free in my art as any white dude has felt. This sort of brings me to my conclusion and advocacy point, really, is that we really must look beyond the simple, the obvious, what you think you may know, and to be able to interpret and infer, and to really explore the deep overlaps that aren't readily visible when looking at, for instance, Black composers, or when looking at human beings, period. So the human characteristics, the life and the value of the person behind the creation, the musical narrative of the arc, of the art itself, so in this case composition, but the piece by itself, what is it expressing, having value, the expressivity in which she is creating, yes, the social, gender, political, economic, class factors, but also the ideologies and the philosophies, the expressions, the preferences of how that individual wants to be remembered, what their legacy, in their own words, how they want to be remembered. This, I think, is certainly something that Florence Price and others wanted, but weren't really able to fully achieve without great struggle and great resistance. Really to be recognized as a full human, defined and not defined by identities of their choosing, I think is very important. So as we're in a time now of reflection and sort of trying to answer what and how, what could I do? How can we move on from here? I would say that same understanding really applies to fully recognize and support our whole human selves, and to celebrate, not exploit, not be exploitative, highlight fully in a holistic way, not extract and sort of piecemeal, when convenient or topical, elements and aspects about someone's identity as it relates to their art. So as much humanization as possible, and understanding that the humanization is related to all these various complicated layers as it relates to all sorts of various complicated factors. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, we will be holding a Q&A after each speaker. So if you have any questions, private message me. Next, we have Ellie Hisama. Ellie is a professor of music and member of the executive committee of the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Columbia University. She has devoted her career to anti-discriminatory work, attending to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in her research, teaching, and administrative commitments. As you can see from the screen up front, today Ellie will be presenting More Than We Can See, Jerry Allen's new initiatives.
Thank you. In her marvelous keynote address yesterday, Terry Lynn Carrington recalled the significance of seeing women who played drums. For her, the first was Dottie Dodgian at the Jazz Festival in Michigan, and the second was Cindy Blackman at the Berklee College of Music. At the 2019 Feminist Theory and Music Conference at Berklee, Carrington sagely noted, "You can't be what you can't see." My talk today reflects on these twin issues of being and seeing through a discussion of Jerry Allen as one woman in jazz whose life story is instructive for all of us, but perhaps especially for the students and young musicians on the call who are trying to be while seeing and hearing about the sexism and racism that infects the jazz and musical world. The stories of how some women have dealt with harassment, bullying, and discrimination, deciding when to speak up and when to remain silent, and thinking about how one can strive for what Carrington calls a warrior spirit can be sustaining. The longer version of my research, to be published in a special issue of Jazz and Culture on Jerry Allen, draws from interviews and conversations with Allen, writings and recollections by others about her, and her own writing, music, teaching, and talks. In this deconstructed version, I show how Allen counters the narratives of male lineage that have dominated many scholarly and popular accounts of jazz. By forging new narratives about jazz that include and foreground women, Allen establishes herself as a vital part of Black women's musical and intellectual history. Through her words and deeds, she constructed a world in which she could do the work she wanted to do as a pianist, composer, educator, and activist, while raising 3 children and mentoring countless students and young musicians. In Carrington's words, she claimed her freedom in holding on to her authentic self. And I just wanted to mention that the photos of Jerry Allen are from Detroit-based photographer Barbara Weinberg-Bearfield. She's graciously allowed me to use her photos, many of which have not been widely circulated, and you'll see a few more. They're just really extraordinary, and she was photographing Jerry Allen from the 1970s. Seeing a woman performer for the first time is a signal moment for many women in jazz. Mary Lou Williams experienced such a formative moment when she attended a concert as a child. In a conversation with D. Antoinette Handy, Williams recalls a memory from when she was 7 or 8 of seeing Lovie Austin perform. We entered this theater and there was this woman sitting up there with her legs crossed, a cigarette in her mouth, playing with her left hand and writing with her right for the next act. Now I saw that myself. Nobody does that. But wait, I did it. I play with one hand and finish a Benny Goodman arrangement with the other. This Austin woman has never left my memory. I can see her sitting in that pit right now. She was a genius. In a conversation with Farah Jasmine Griffin, Jerry Allen talks about seeing the pianist and vibraphonist Terry Pollard for the first time.
You have early on, were there models of women who were involved in the music that, you know, where you could look and say, okay, yes, that's something that I can see myself doing, or did that not matter to you?
Well, that did happen, and I think that's a really important question, too, because to have the opportunity to see someone who is really, you know, making it happen in a certain way. I mean, I remember Terry Pollard playing in Terry Gibbs's band and having a chance to see her live at a place called the Masonic Temple in Detroit. And the fact that she got up from the piano after having torn the piano apart, and then got up and played the vibes and tore that apart, you know. And it was just a great awakening for me, because I'm looking at this woman who had the respect of the, you know, all of the musicians on the bandstand in a certain, you know, I mean, just really commanding her presence there. And that was a huge, I think, breakthrough for me to be able to see her. So certainly she was, you know, the first woman that I saw in performance and on my instrument. And that definitely changed my life.
And how?
Alan's vivid recollection, nearly 40 years later, of the electric moment of seeing Pollard play emphasizes the critical importance of seeing a woman performing on the instrument she played, of witnessing the respect Pollard commanded on the stage, and of experiencing an awakening that followed that experience of seeing. Alan enrolled at Cass Tech High School in Detroit, a school with a renowned music program whose alums include Dorothy Ashby, Donald Byrd, Regina Carter, Ron Carter, Alice Coltrane, Sir Roland Hanna, Marion Hayden, Diana Ross, Lucky Thompson, and other superb musicians. There she met an extraordinary teacher, an alumna at the University of Michigan. This is Jerry Allen. A woman named Marilyn Jones, a really great flautist and choral conductor, decided it was important to have a jazz ensemble at Cass Tech. And she was a peer of Donald Byrd's, who was also an alumnus of Cass. She was as well. So she organized a jazz ensemble and had people in residency. Marcus Belgrave, who became a very important part of my development, was one of those people that ushered me into the jazz community. With Marcus, there was a pipeline from high school right into the safety zone in the scene. We saw the passion and professionalism up close. What Marcus has done for Detroit and what he's done for all of us, he is truly a national treasure. How much we love him can't be expressed in words. And this is Jerry Allen at the piano with Marcus Belgrave and the new Detroit Jazz Ensemble. So this is 1978. So she is very young here. I think 20, let's see, 18 plus 3, 21. And please note the woman playing the bass clarinet, who's right by the piano, because we're getting to her later. And this is opening for Ray Charles. Ellen recalls that Belgrave introduced her to Detroit composer, pianist, and educator Bess Bonnier, with whom she studied piano. Belgrave mentored Alan first as a young musician and then into her career, calling her, quote, the most absorbent student that I encountered. She, in turn, included him on 5 of her albums over a 26-year period. Responding to a question from Farrah Griffin, who was a close friend and artistic collaborator, about whether Cass Tech was a supportive environment for her, Alan describes her experience at the famed high school.
On their track and knew that they wanted to pursue this as a career. So it was very serious and competitive in a positive way. And I felt too that having that experience of, which was very challenging because, I mean, I'm in a group of all young men, one other young woman, bass clarinetist, and myself. And it wasn't a very friendly environment at the time, but it gave me a view of what I might have to deal with as a musician. And it gave me kind of the strength, how can I put it? It gave me a good start in terms of whether I really wanted to do this or not. Because, you know, the guys weren't really that pleased with our being a part of the group at the time. And so they were creating these levels of, you know, things that kind of were it made you have to just make a decision, is this something that I'm going to want to contend with? Do I want to really be in this kind of competitive environment? And it was very helpful. It was a very helpful start.
How'd you end up at Howard?
Ellen chooses her words judiciously in describing her experience as a female musician at Cass Tech, dominated at the time by male musicians. In this public conversation, she does not detail just what the challenges were in an environment that wasn't very friendly from the male students who weren't really that pleased about having even 2 female peers. And you saw them, Jerry Allen and Elrita Dodds. She remembers Cass Tech as a place where the guys were giving us girls such a hard time, but she puts a positive spin on her experience by emphasizing what she identifies as the resistance she developed. And yesterday, if you heard the keynote, the word was resilience. So this is not Cass Tech, but I think it gives you a sense of what she was experiencing. This is 1981, so she is May 1981, so she's almost 24, I think. In her conversation with Griffin, Griffin observed that Alan's experience consisted of resistance that you met from your peers, and yet the support that you got from these master musicians, male and female. Alan noted her appreciation of Griffin's framing of her experience and reflection that the resistance made you stronger, made you better. She emphasized that the other things helped to give you character in a way. You have to make the decision as to whether you really love this enough. Sometimes it can be difficult, but in the bigger picture, it's part of the process. Belgrave was a key figure who helped Alan to navigate the challenges of being a female student at Cass Tech. Alan recalls, it was a very competitive environment. We were ridiculed a lot, but the fact of the matter was that the teacher, who was Marcus Belgrave, a very great trumpet player, he saw our potential, so he would back all of that. And what I realized too is that it's always been that way. Musicians who are real musicians, who are the deepest, were just about the music. There are no other agendas around that insecurity, personal insecurities with their manhood or whatever they are going through. She also commented that Belgrave secured a number of really great musicians from Detroit to play my little songs, a huge boost for me as a young player, and an act that, quote, gave me a confidence about my composition, my ability to be a composer, the possibility of that. Belgrave helped Alan to recognize the value of her work, and through his support and that of other teachers, she learned to tune out the unhelpful voices. In her residency at Columbia University's Center for Jazz Studies, Alan noted the connection of spirituals to the ancestors. Composer and pianist Courtney Bryan, then a DMA student in composition at Columbia, performed Fats Waller's Jitterbug Waltz, followed by her own arrangement of the spiritual Wade in the Water in a master class with Alan. Oops, sorry.
What's different than the traditional? Could you please, just demonstrate the traditional first?
So normally, I guess it's played a lot more calm or more solemn, I think.
And then could you play your version to the melody? Beautiful. There's a power in this that I feel immediately that comes from more than we can see. And I think it's, for me, it's like I begin my concerts with a spiritual as well. And I think that there's something about an acknowledgement. I'm sorry to have my back to you all, but there's something about an acknowledgement of the history, the experience of the people that created this music by doing a libation, so to speak, a musical tribute in the beginnings of the concerts. For me, whenever I do that, there's a sense of clarity that comes no matter where I am, no matter what kind of hall, what kind of instrument, what the challenges of whatever the environment might be. And when I hear you play this, for me, I think it's a connection it connects us in a way to the legacy of the music in its early, the ancestors, the whole feeling of the, the connection of all of these people that made it possible for us to be here doing what we're doing now. So I applaud you for that. I think it's important that that is continued and that we find, that lives. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention with the left hand,
the historical connections Alan draws in offering these reflections about Brian's arrangement and performance of Wade in the Water before proceeding to more technical discussion of Brian's harmonic choices and her use of the left hand vividly demonstrate Alan's keen sense of the ancestors, an appreciation for the traditional and the modern, and the importance of sharing this sense of lineage with a younger developing artist. And I wanted to share a sentence that Courtney Bryan wrote after Jerry Allen passed. From both the innovative sound I heard and the image of someone who looks like me, never underestimate the power of representation. I realized a path in front of me. The whole feeling of the connection is, in Alan's words, more than we can see. A deeply spiritual feeling that connects a musician and her listeners to the ancestors, the family into which a musician is born, the people who made it possible for us to be here doing what we're doing. Alan's instruction to Brian addressed aspects of technique, the importance of knowing the work, and what Brian identifies as the larger vision. As Jason Moran observed about Alan, she taught us how to see ourselves and our ancestors in the music. Griffin notes that Alan was always interested in the role of race and ethnicity, and she became even more interested in gender. Alan was artistic director and founder of the all-female jazz residency at the New Jersey Performing Arts Center, renamed the Jerry Allen All-Female Jazz Camp this year, a summer program begun for young women to work with distinguished artists, to hear other musicians, and to perform. Regina Carter, the current artistic director of the all-female jazz camp, observes that there are unique challenges that female musicians can face, balancing family, performing, traveling, teaching, working in a male-dominated field, etc. We engage in sister-to-sister talks and discuss a wide range of issues, offering strategies and solutions to arm the young women for success. The camp's inclusion of discussion about gender bias and the obstacles women face in the profession recognizes and confronts a reality that many women in jazz have experienced in the field, including Alan, as we heard in yesterday's discussion from Professor Hurst. Her musical partner and friend, Terry Lynn Carrington, states that Jerry questioned if she was accepted or respected in the same way as her male contemporaries, and mentions her, quote, resistance to accepting what she felt was unfair in our co-led bands and combating the, quote, repressive mindsets of people that devalue the work that we as artists do. After Alan's death in 2017, Craig Tate recalled J.T. Lewis's words about Alan. He went there and just said it. If Jerry was a man, she'd have been celebrated as a giant a long time ago. Robin Kelly recalls that at a special meeting of Columbia University's Jazz Studies group in 2001, Alan shared a story about her commission by Jazz at Lincoln Center. The time allotted to her piece on the program was diminished in order to give more time to a male pianist who was also commissioned. A New York Times critic gave Alan's piece and performance a negative review in contrast to his fulsome review of the male pianists. Kelly observes that Alan, quote, took it all in stride, never once casting aspersions or showing anger. Instead, she used the occasion to examine the institutional limitations on women artists and the impact it has on the work itself. Those who knew Alan recall that she was very soft-spoken, introspective, a woman of few words but of significant action, and possessing a quiet dignity, grace, and generosity. She was not one to highlight sexism or gendered experiences as negatively affecting her career. In 1989, Peter Urpeth asked her if she, quote, felt things were bad for women in jazz and if being a woman had in any way altered the course of her music. She responded, probably, but only in the sense that there is something particular about each of our individual experiences and who you are and what things make up your family background, the experiences you grew up with, the period of time you came up in the area you grew up in, the very specific things that are individual to each of us. I should say I've been very much supported by people like Marcus Belgrave and my father in Detroit. I never encountered any sexism or prejudice from them or from the people that I was around. I never thought that it was strange for me to be doing what I am doing. There's been a lot of strong voices from women musicians throughout the history of this music that have made it possible for me to be doing what I'm doing. Rather than dwelling in public interviews on the effects of gender bias on her training or career, Ellen highlighted the contributions to jazz by other women, including Mary Lou Williams, Lil Hardin Armstrong, Lovie Austin, Terry Pollard, Betty Carter, and Marilyn Jones, while not giving short shrift to the importance of male musicians and teachers. Allen's determination to convey the importance of Black women in the history of jazz was manifest in her work as a composer, performer, collaborator, and educator. Jason Moran declares, a big part of how she wanted to make sure the future was educated was seeing to it that women had a sense of place and agency and power. One of the most important aspects of her legacy is what she represents for the African-American woman in jazz. She made sure that stayed firmly in people's eyes and that you had to be able to reckon with that history. She wanted to make sure that history was not going to be deleted or erased on her watch. She was going to put the work in to make sure that you would know Mary Lou Williams' name. Through her advocacy, teaching, and performance of Williams, Lil Hardin Armstrong, and other women's music, Allen worked to underscore the importance of a history in which women were central contributors. Through her composing, performing, mentorship, talks, and teaching, Allen stitched together a compelling narrative of jazz, one deeply connected to the ancestors and animated by an inclusive vision of those who innovated. In her words, I think we have to continue on in the spirit of what Mary Lou Williams was saying and Dr. Billy Taylor. Our heroes would say, this is your culture, embrace it. You don't want to lose who you are. And that's what happens when you don't embrace your culture, you disappear. These aspects of acknowledging and celebrating the music's roots empower the music when it remains connected to its source. Studying Allen's rich archive of work in sound and grasping her manifold contributions are fundamental to gaining a more comprehensive understanding of jazz, American music, and indeed music history and theory writ large. She and other women artists are central rather than peripheral in this new narrative about jazz that she helped to write, circumventing the women in jazz paragraphs that check the diversity box in male-centric lineages. Exploring the storehouse of knowledge and ideas present in the work of artist intellectuals such as Allen, whose tremendous achievements were not fully recognized during their lifetimes, is a necessary step towards acknowledging and honoring our predecessors and becoming keenly aware of the luminous presence of more than we can see. Thank you. I'm just going to quickly share this resource list I made. So the special issue I mentioned, which is coming out from the journal Jazz and Culture, the symposium I put in the chat yesterday at the keynote. So it is free. It's November 5th. It'll give us something to think about besides what happened 2 days before. It has an amazing lineup of people, including Terry Lynn Carrington, Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Farrah Griffin, Courtney, Fred Moten, George Lewis, Kevin Fellas, Vijay Iyer. It's just like amazing people who are speaking at this event, and you're all invited. We can host 3,000 people. And then the book by Barbara Barefield is coming out. This is a revised and expanded work that she published years ago, but there are a number of new photos, and the text is by Herb Boyd. So it's Jazz Space Detroit, and it's coming out next year. There's her website. And then there's a documentary also, which is on her website and on YouTube, which has all sorts of lovely photos and stories. So she narrates it. And I guess part of the point of my talk is know the history, but know more than the history of one person, which I think also was what Ashleigh was saying. It can't just be one person in the heat of the moment because you want to feel better about yourself. It has to be, we need to know the history of all those who came before us, and there is just so much richness there. And we'll stop talking very soon, but I wanted to just share this amazing photo from Barbara's book. So Sippy Wallace was from Detroit, and this is her great grand niece playing with her. So she had a friend who said, you've got to like get back into playing and performing. And she was active later in life. So I think in her 70s or 80s. So she's featured in this documentary. And I think there are just so many people whose histories, music, work, we don't know, and we need to know it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this incredible, informative presentation and for those resources. Next, we have Stephanie Jensen-Moulton. I already announced her bio in the beginning, but she will be talking today. Her talk today is called What's So Bad About Feeling Good? White Fragility in the Music Fields. Stephanie?
Okay, sorry, it just took me a second. So thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here, and I want to thank Ellie and Ashleigh for what they've said in their talks, and Allison and the organizing team for this incredible and really important event. It's wonderful to be with all of you. And I want to start with a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that I'm giving this paper from my home in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, which occupies the ancestral lands of the Lenape, Canarsie, and Nyack peoples who were expelled and enslaved by white settlers. For more information on these indigenous peoples, there's a website there, but there are just increasingly more and more places where you can find all of the information for land acknowledgements. So this talk expands on the ideas that we've heard in the conference today and yesterday, and it frames them more in terms of institutional oppression of both gender and race. And I'm drawing upon my experience as a professor and as a former department chair, and bringing things a little bit back into the institution that really influences what we study and how we study it. So a few weeks ago, while I was doing dishes, I turned on a podcast, and the theme of the podcast was watching movies at home during the pandemic with your family or your friends or by yourself. And one of the commentators did a piece on a 1968 film set in Manhattan entitled What's So Bad About Feeling Good? In the film, a highly contagious virus strikes the city, threatening to close down schools and businesses and even spread to the rest of the US and the world. In a bizarrely prescient scenario, a Fauci-esque doctor even lobbies for New Yorkers to wear masks like the ones we've all grown used to wearing. And unlike the virus that we're dealing with, though, this mid-century fictional virus has only one symptom. It makes people unspeakably, unreservedly happy and totally comfortable. In considering this talk, I began to think about the idea of comfort. When people feel comfortable, they feel good and things are easy. No group in the US has had more comfort than white people. And we white people have grown so used to our relative comfort that discomfort has become an intolerable feeling. So what I want to talk about today is the question that white people ask: when it's either internal or external, consciously or unconsciously, when our comfortable way of life is called into question or threatened. What's so bad about feeling good? Before I dive any deeper into this, I just want to acknowledge that I don't have any special credentials that allow me to speak with more credibility on this topic than anyone else. I'll just briefly self-identify as a cis hetero white woman with a hidden disability, and I teach in a conservatory of music that's within an urban public university. A colleague of mine said recently that only people who are qualified to teach and talk about critical race theory should talk about race in public. And maybe by the end of this talk, you all will agree with him. But I think that's part of the problem. We, especially the white we, need to stop relying on our BIPOC peers to educate us about issues of race at the expense of their time and emotional labor. And we need to start engaging in more of these conversations ourselves. So I want to start by bringing together three frequently used terms that are interrelated, but not exactly the same: white supremacy culture, white privilege, and white fragility. You'll notice, though, that the one thing they have in common is that they put white first. Even for the most well-meaning, woke white liberal, this poses a problem, and maybe for some, a threat. Daniel Buford and Tema Okun from the organization Dismantling Racism posit that because we all live in white supremacy culture, the following characteristics show up in the attitudes and behaviors of all of us, people of color and white people. Therefore, these attitudes and behaviors can show up in any group or organization, whether it's white-led or predominantly white, or people of color-led or predominantly people of color. The first time I read Buford and Okun's paper, which was recommended to me by a colleague in sociology, I immediately noticed a confluence between the ideals held dear in a conventional university music curriculum, and by this I mean National Association of Schools of Music, accredited or similar, and the characteristics that Buford and Okun point out, which I'll list here on the slide. To begin with, perfectionism has been a long-held cultural value in music studies. This is particularly true of work in instrumental or vocal performance, but also in the scholarly fields of musicology and music theory. A missed note, a botched performance, a typo, the wrong citation format. Students are taught to compete against one another for a handful of gigs, orchestral, studio, or academic jobs, and that just one mistake could end their chances at a career. And I think this is very much a gendered paradigm, expecting perfection of men, but less from women. Rather than exploring their own worth within a musical or academic community or in creative industries, students learn that they're utterly replaceable. So they head back into the practice room or the study carrel to fix that passage or that solo. This leads to an increased valuation of individualism, giving students and community members the feeling that they're totally on their own, person against person. And as in most humanity fields, single authored works by music scholars are valued more than multi-authored works, just as solo performances tend to gain more recognition than ensemble performances. Before reading Buford and Okun's article, it never crossed my mind that this individualistic culture had anything to do with whiteness. But a work culture that celebrates individuals who don't need help and don't need to check in can have literally deadly consequences. Not only is it smart leadership to delegate so that you as a leader can get your work done well, but it also sets up a system for accountability in the organization. And individuals without accountability can be and have been deadly to BIPOC students and colleagues, not to mention those who belong to the LGBTQ+ communities and those who identify as disabled. A sense of urgency is another of the values that we've adopted in the music fields. The sense that we have to get this piece learned immediately or this hire done right now before the opportunity passes, rather than stopping to consider how a more inclusive democratic solution could work, even if it takes a little bit longer. I'll give the example of performance urgency. We have the funding for the performance right now, and if we stop to consider who's playing or what's actually on the program, we'll lose the funding or we'll lose the audience that we've always had. Initiating a conversation that begins with, well, what if we did this a little differently, might result in some defensiveness. And this has become a hallmark of conversations about race with and among, but not limited to, white people. Chiefly, though we might not openly admit it, we're afraid of being perceived as or even called racist, which might lead to open conflict, something that many people also fear. And I have to add here that the same can be said of conversations about gender equality, the defensive answer being, but I'm not sexist, or just a total end to the conversation. But how do these ideas manifest in the music fields? Consider, for example, these very ordinary scenarios that are totally possible really in any music school situation where defensiveness and conflict might arise. One, maybe two different ensembles need the same space at the same time for a performance. Two, maybe there's one new faculty position open and faculty and staff can't decide which music field's needs are more pressing. Three, maybe some students and teachers want to reconsider the curriculum offerings to broaden students' experiences with music using improvised and oral traditions. So here are 9 more ways that white supremacy culture has upheld discriminatory practices at institutions and universities. Could these 3 situations, and feel free to type your ideas in the slides, have anything to do with these ideas of white supremacy? For example, the 2 ensembles that need the same space. First, there might be a sense that one ensemble takes precedence over another, or that there's only room for one. This indicates a kind of either or thinking rather than both and thinking. Like there can only be one answer or one ensemble that gets the space rather than sharing it, for example, or doing a concert that features both ensembles. And how is it decided? Is there only one right way, or how do people make that choice? Is it based on importance, seniority, the enrollment of the ensemble? And this also indicates emphasis on power hoarding, keeping spaces, opportunities, funding for certain subjects, projects, and ensembles over others. And this also possibly indicates quality over quantity, or sorry, quantity over quality, where decisions are made because of enrollment or cash flow rather than social justice or community-based issues. And I'm sure none of us have experienced anything like that in the university system. All of these ideas could apply to the second scenario about contention over a faculty job as well. But in addition, Buford and Okun articulate that white supremacy culture tends to value written traditions over oral ones, a notation they label worship of the written word. And I think this is really key to the relationships we build between music fields. Because faculty hiring decisions are made so often in consideration of courses that have to be taught so students can graduate, not to mention the number of students in a program indicating that progress equals bigger and more, there's a direct correlation between who is hired and what's going on in the curriculum. So if the process of course revision that those students might want, which at this historical moment we can call decolonizing the curriculum, has been slow, the odds are that that hire will go to somebody who plays or teaches a written musical tradition. And finally, with that curriculum change, even if the students themselves may have petitioned for that change and may even have written it, not only would those changes have to be approved through a process that's probably totally opaque to them, and maybe even to most of the faculty, but those doing the approving would likely have little contact with the writers of the actual curriculum changes. And this is a perfect example of paternalism, where those with the power to make decisions really don't communicate with those who are affected by them. Another typical guise of paternalism in university music studies is the role of the major lesson teacher or the mentor advisor. Students quickly learn not to risk their grades or their careers by questioning the decisions their teacher or advisor makes about repertoire or course of study. And we heard a lot about this in some of the previous sessions. And this particularly applies to women who are perceived as less willing to make those kinds of overtures to say, hey, I'm not really sure that that's the right chord, or I'm not sure that that's the repertoire I want to study. Or substitute here a tenured faculty mentor and an adjunct staff teaching member. Those people are more likely to be women and people of color. If she should assert an opinion contrary to that of the mentor, her objectivity is questioned. And in addition, her ability to perform the work that's needed. So the mentor's response reinforces the idea that objectivity is real and that it's possible to move through the world and make decisions from a neutral point of view. It also buttresses the mentor's power while invalidating conversation, opinion, and emotion as modes of being and communication, all of which, by the way, are of course feminized in culture. Not only does the idea of objectivity as a reality support the primacy of whiteness, but it supports this patriarchal positivist culture in higher education. And I'm just riffing with these three scenarios. There are so many more ways in which these characteristics play out in higher education. And I'm sure all of you have experienced scenarios where this has all gone down. So I want to step back for a moment and recall a bit of anecdata from my earliest days of doctoral coursework back in about 2003. Before I was a musicology student, I was a DMA voice major. And for all of the reasons that led me to later become a musicologist, I was also pursuing a certificate in women's studies. So imagine my excitement when I saw a course that was cross-listed with music and women and gender studies. And one of the co-instructors was a Black feminist scholar whom I'd heard talk in my major feminist text class. I was so excited. I'm just fangirling a little bit here. But this co-listed course, unfortunately, got off to a really rocky start. Already the professors had chosen a hot button topic, the history of Blackface minstrelsy. The music professor, a white senior Americanist scholar, brought along his syllabus, and the feminist scholar brought along one of her own design. So from the start, there wasn't any real communication between the two, and their ideas about the topic were diametrically opposed. While he wanted to consider the subject object by object, show by show, performer by performer in a chronological manner, she considered the race and gender implications of minstrel performances to be paramount, and that no item of sheet music or production could be considered or discussed without a thorough understanding of 19th century African American life. So either approach could be viable, but you see the problem. So the shared experience of that seminar led those of us who remained in the course to talk about what worked and what didn't work. Was it the lack of communication between the professors? Maybe. Was it the subject matter? Maybe. But what we've all come to agree upon is that music and performance, especially history, are subjective. Minstrelsy, with its inflammatory images and lyrics, flouts the very notion of objectivity. And the trouble between these two incredibly accomplished scholars was a mutual insistence that the other could be objective in their point of view. And by December of that semester, and to me this is the worst and probably the most indicative point, the feminist scholar had lost all interest in the class and seemed to feel totally disenfranchised by everything to do with the class. And she was really made to feel as though she was totally uncomfortable in her own classroom. And none of us in retrospect could be objective about that experience. So the final characteristic of white supremacy culture referenced by Buford and Okun circles back to the start of this talk. History, when taught without omissions, and we can flag the horrible debate from earlier this week, tells us that the most heinous laws in the US have been written to ensure the comfort of groups in power, whether they be white, affluent, Christian, able-bodied, US citizen, heterosexual, male, or all of the above. These ideas, writ small, seep through the cracks in our institutions in the form of complacency and a general feeling that some people have a right to comfort. So what is so bad about feeling good? I imagine that initiating conversations about some of these ideas might not be at all comfortable for some of you, maybe not for me, maybe not for some of your colleagues. If you call someone out, you might hear, well, what's wrong with expecting my student to play a perfect performance or write a flawless paper? Or what's wrong with having an all-male record? So I'm singing the magic flute. Does that mean I'm a white supremacist? This type of expression of discomfort and defensiveness is where white fragility and white privilege intersect with white supremacy culture and help to reinforce it. White privilege is what allows whites, and even the ones who want to be kind or do good, to ignore what's going on around us, up to and including state-sanctioned murder, and keep going with the status quo. Michelle Alexander notes in The New Jim Crow that this campaign of legalized discrimination has been in place since just after the Civil War. But since it's not happening directly to whites, we don't really have to address it. It's a choice, and that choice is a privilege. In the same way, it would seem easy to maintain the status quo in the institutions, music schools, colleges, universities, ensembles, scholarly journals and societies, recording studios, etc., so long as the leadership feels comfortable with things as they are. So does it make a difference what we play or what we study or what we write about? A couple of semesters after I took that minstrelsy seminar, I took Ellie Hisama's doctoral seminar on the history and criticism of hip hop. And Ellie, forgive me if that's not the exact title of the course. It's been like 15 years. One week, Ellie shared an encounter she'd had with a fellow scholar who, upon hearing about the course she was teaching, curled his lip and muttered something about hip hop as not music. In fact, unlike the outcome of any other doctoral music class, Ellie led us to publish a collection of essays within 2 years of that seminar. And for many of us, it was a first publication. On the last day of the course, she handed out our final papers with her quite enthusiastic markings and this matte grinning comic. And I just want to point out over here, it says, "Will your research make the world a better place?" And this little guy is like, yeah, sure. And I've always thought of that in the back of my mind. Is it going to make the world a better place? But I think it does make a difference. I like to think that it does make a difference what you do for your research, and what you choose to perform and write about can make a difference. But as Michelle Alexander so starkly tells us in her work, a new social understanding about race must begin with a dialogue, a conversation that fosters a critical consciousness, a key prerequisite to effective social action. This book is an attempt to ensure that the conversation does not end with nervous laughter. That nervous laughter, that defensiveness, is white fragility at work, insisting that racism is a single event rather than a whole system of oppression. In light of that, and recognizing that everything I've just said is totally meaningless without stepping up and getting it done, here are 3 preliminary actions that I've initiated at my institution and internally. I'm working with my colleagues on rewriting and decolonizing music curriculum to ensure that my students take at least one course before they graduate in which race, gender, and disability are discussed. It's just so easy to graduate from a music curriculum without ever having talked in an academic setting about race, class, and gender. And I think it just has to be done. And I'm considering ways in which social and economic barriers have prevented talented students from auditioning for undergraduate majors and creating new routes of access. I think one of the biggest issues we have in the music fields is that music lessons are really expensive. And many of our students don't have the ability to audition under the circumstances that we give them. There are a lot of barriers just to auditioning. You have to have owned an instrument, you have to have learned certain repertoires, and I think those are barriers for many students. And so I am thinking about ways that we can move past that audition and actually offer our talented and exciting students some training as they get to college. And I think that's going to be an important way to engage with more students who have a lot of potential. And the third thing I'm doing is I'm embracing the discomfort of an ugly history that's my history as a white person. And I'm looking forward to learning a lot more together with all of you. So thank you for letting me be here and enjoy and learn from all of you.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. Thank you all for your insightful and thought-provoking presentations. I know we have a few questions, so I'm gonna call on a few people and they can unmute themselves to ask you. First, we have a question for Ellie from Allison Thabit, if you wanna unmute yourself.
Hello. I loved hearing your presentation. That was so interesting. And I guess my question is, so in your work doing scholarly research surrounding women musicians, and with like a focus on intersectionality, have you faced like barriers to getting that information, those archives? Because I mean, I don't know, even like in high school when I tried to do like, you know, high school paper level research, there was just not a lot of scholarly works to go on, or even like just finding like photos. And then when I did write a paper on women in jazz, I like gave it to my high school band director, and like I don't even know if he read it, to be honest. But like I don't know, like I just wanted to know, like have you had these sorts of experiences, and like what do you do about them?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I've had these issues like my entire life, basically. So, so I went to undergraduate. I first did an English major and then music major in the 80s, and then my PhD is from 96. So I've been committed to this work despite like trendiness. So the fashions come and go. So I was between like second wave feminism and Black Lives Matter. So I've just done what I've believed in, trying to keep central what I think is important, whether someone's going to approve it or not. And your question about the archives is key, because I've had terrible trouble with archives. I'm still having terrible trouble with archives. So it's not a problem that goes away. I think Stephanie's presentation talks about like how institutions determine action and thinking. So it's not always individuals, it's like the structures within where placed. And then individuals can try to do something, as she's trying to do things decolonizing the curriculum. But I can give you an example of Julius Eastman. So he's someone I wrote an article on. It took me 8 years to finish it. It was just because there was no archive. So he was evicted, his papers were tossed out the window. His brother said he was living in Tompkins Square Park. So there was no music, but then people slowly started to piece it together, like, oh, I have a score from when I played his piece. So it's all over the place, like Minneapolis, Buffalo, New York City, but there's no like one archive. So when you have that sort of fragmentation, and then on the other hand, there's like such a rush, like also related to Stephanie's thinking about like, what do we prioritize? Well, we're always in a hurry. We have to do this fast now, like perfectly. And then with Julius Eastman, because we need like, you know, a Black queer composer, like finally we're recognizing someone, and there's something called East Mania in the UK, as there's a name for it. I think a lot of the work is being done sloppily. So I think we have to work with care and to think about his situation. And I've just read some atrocious things written about him. Like one music critic said something about, well, his problem was he was born Black and gay. Like these were considered by this white male author to be his handicaps, that he had to be Black and gay. If he had been like a white guy like him, like life would have been like hunky-dory. So Ruth Crawford's another example. So I worked on her music for my dissertation and published the book Gendering Musical Modernism. In the 1980s, I saw an ad up from the Library of Congress looking for a student intern to work on the collection. I went to see that collection a few years ago, maybe 25 years later. It's still a mess. So you go there, there's boxes and boxes and boxes of unarchived or unsorted material. In contrast to Milton Babbitt, if you go see Milton Babbitt's archive, it is perfectly placed, organized, because an archivist there cares about him and no one cares about her. So there's this whole structure of prioritizing work, which you'll confront. So what I would say in a nutshell, and then I'll let someone else speak, is you have to be determined and try to be creative around the obstacles that are placed before you. And then also when you face someone's disdain, like when I was a graduate student, someone asked me what my dissertation was on. I was trying to explain to him, Stephanie, I think this is someone else from the person you were talking about. And he said, so what did these gals write? Symphonies, string quartets, operas, like these gals. And it's like, and then they're considered valuable if they wrote those big forms, not if they wrote just lieder, not if they just wrote solo piano music. So I think you have to have this core self, which says, this is the work that's important and I'm going to do it despite the obstacles, which are institutional and personal.
Thank you. Our next question is for Ashleigh. Josie, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, first of all, I just want to thank Ellie and Stephanie for their incredibly thought-provoking presentations as well. And this question can also be open to you two as well. But for Ashleigh, you brought up the idea of recognizing these female composers, recognizing themselves as fully formed, multifaceted human beings with complex layers and factors, and instead of just, you know, a set of tokenizable traits. So that's always kind of been a paradox to me as a performer, you know, approaching music, wanting to both have my femininity represented, but also not just be seen as that, if that makes sense. You know, I've been looking into conversations about modern music, especially with, you know, pop singers like Nicki Minaj, Megan Thee Stallion, how their sexuality is seen as either empowering or degrading, and not simply, you know, a facet of who they are as a whole being and performer. So from your research, how have you seen these female composers, you know, either embrace their femininity in their work or separate it from it?
Sure, yeah, I think that's a great question. I think so much, and also tying with Ellie, comes from scholarship, and it comes from music critics. So those who do the power hoarding and those who are controlling general consciousness and perception, such as music critics, often have the power, and they are not of Black women, or they're not of a music background or have any sort of relationship with the actual person. And they're unfortunately have the most power to be able to dictate around that. But there are, from even the cases that I had given with Florence Price, who created in Chicago this Harlem Renaissance where Marian Anderson was a neighbor and Langston Hughes was a friend, and Margaret Bonds was a student that she could work with, and her mother was involved with various social clubs, and a neighbor created the National Association for Negro Musicians. There was very much a sense of community, where within a culture, within a group of people, we could write our own narrative. I think that's also true in hearing Ellie's talk, reminded me of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, where literally we want to create our own rules. We want to create our own school. We want to make our own definitions and sort of, you know, screw everybody else with what you might perceive of me. I think there's very much that attitude, especially as there was a rise during the civil rights movement and feeling of Black empowerment, upward economic mobility, and very much family and community, where our narratives will be dictated by ourselves. There's again lots of scholarship, I think, around there. Helen Walker Hill being one of those scholars. Dominique René Delerma, who I think about with Center for Black Music Research, where boxes of his music is just archived, and then the archive now doesn't even exist. But anyway, there are these sort of documentarians within the culture that are really trying to preserve and advocate for on behalf of the culture. So if you can find those sources and help with your words and with your action in your life, be part of those sources, that's where I tend to go, and sort of whatever, music critic in the New York Times or whatever you have to say, that's all great, but where is it coming from? From whose source is it coming from?
Awesome. Should we go to the next question then? Okay. Next question. Gerald, I think, had a couple of questions. If you want to unmute yourself, and maybe let's start with one, see what time we're looking at.
Thanks. I've decided that one is more important than the other. So I'll start with that. My question is particularly for Stephanie because of your experience as a department chair. Yesterday in our, you can hear me. Yesterday in I think the first discussion, somebody who, unfortunately, their name I can't remember, brought up the idea that there are a lot of people who are disadvantaged by the travel factor when they're auditioning for school of whatever kind. And so I'm also noticing that now we have to do these Zoom auditions anyway, or recorded auditions of some sort or whatever. And I'm also realizing that, auditioning behind a curtain has turned out to be very productive for people. So couldn't we use a sort of anonymous recorded remote audition to create some sort of a curtain behind which people could audition in order to just level some part of the playing field a little bit and also alleviate the idea or the problem of having to travel? What do you think about that as a department chair? I mean, I'm sure that I'm not. So what obstacles do you see in the way of that?
Yeah, Gerald, I think that's a great question. And I think it speaks to kind of the complexities of the time that we're in right now, where everything had to change very quickly. And I think also it speaks to the inequities in terms of who has technology, who has instruments, and who doesn't. A lot of students, I'm thinking of high school seniors and people who maybe are in the New York City public schools where I am, may have borrowed their instruments from their schools. And I know that when we left on, all of a sudden on March 17th, there were several students where I teach that, I had one student who didn't have access to her bass for like 2 months because the bass was still at the college and she had just gone home, and I don't think had anticipated that she wouldn't be able to get back onto the campus. So there are issues of, getting back onto the campus or getting back to the school where your instrument is, and making sure that students who need their instruments have them at home. So there's that issue. And then I love your idea of like a screened audition where, especially for instrumentalists, there's no sense of what the gender might be of the performer, or in terms of exactly disabilities, or I think biases about what the sexuality of the performer might be, because I think we all know that there are certain folks out there who might be homophobic, and they might have the sense, for whatever reason, that the mannerisms of a person might display some kind of either erroneous or whatever kind of sexuality to them that might either be a factor in favor or against that person. So I love this idea of a more anonymous audition process. And one question that we've talked a lot about since the pandemic began is, can we go back to the really arcane systems that we had before the pandemic occurred? And why should we? If we've made this much progress in terms of some of the issues of equity, do we have to go back to that place where we were using paper forms and things were much less equal? We're distributing laptops now. We're distributing iPads to students who didn't have them. But I think some of the other issues that are more pernicious in this situation are that there are more inequities at the home. I mean, I think we all know about the domestic violence issues that have been on the increase, and the mental health issues too that are at home. And that's going to make it harder for students with those disabilities and those risks to do an audition at home, because it's going to put them in a place that's going to be more difficult than it would otherwise be, where school is their safe place. So I think it's a complex issue, but I'm really glad you brought it up, Gerald, because I think it's a really important one.
Great. I think we're out of time for today, but I want to thank all of you for being here, for asking such great questions. Thank you to Ashleigh, Ellie, and Stephanie for such thought-provoking and insightful presentations. Thank you for the resources you've provided, the questions you've asked, and thank you for the solutions you've offered, or at least ways to progress, because that's all we have right now. So I appreciate your time, and thank you everyone again for being here. I want to thank again my team. I'm gonna name everyone one more time: Alon Sullivan, Josie Alla, who asked a question, Meg Brennan, Sammy Sussman, Eliza Salem, Bob Hurst, Ed Sereth, Mark Hannaford, Aiden Taylor. I want to thank our sponsor for this event, the Transformation for the Musical Academe. And I want to announce that tonight at 7 o'clock, we have our keynote speaker, Camille Thurman. So I hope to see you all there, and thank you again to our lovely speakers.